So I asked you all to, if you all wanted us to do more Mr. Bond reactions, to like the last one, and yeah, y'all liked it a fair amount, and I greatly appreciate that. I mean, if you all enjoy us reacting to Mr. Bond, I mean, I'm glad that that's the case, and just hey, if you want to keep seeing more, you know the drill. Leave a like right down there. I think it's right at my feet, or where my feet would be, on this crazy YouTube web page kind of thing. I don't know. But yeah, Mr. Ballin, uh, we're here watching one called "The Parties That Changed Everything." Top two stories that sound fake but are 100% true. So yeah, this is part 30 or episode 31. Given the fact that there's 31 of these, it's like Jesus. It's like maybe we need to go back and watch some of the older ones. We'll see. We'll see about that. Feel free to let the requests fly. I mean, either in the request channel or just let us know, and heck in the comment section. Although we do pay more attention to our request channel, every now and again I see stuff in the comments. I'm like, that seems interesting. But yeah, feel free to do that if you want. But yeah, parties that changed everything. I don't know what parties parties I've been to that changed everything. I would say the one where basically I was sitting there waiting for my girlfriend to show up at the time, and Froggy was like, he handed me a guitar and he was just like, dude, play a song for these girls, I was like, okay, fine. And I started playing music, and then pretty soon, like, I had like 3 or 4 girls like sitting around me, like singing along with me on stuff. I was playing like stuff that they knew, and then eventually I got dragged over the back of the couch and like dropped on my head and got the crap beat out of me by like 3 or 4 dudes, and basically, they basically beat the shit out of me.
It's fucked up.
It is, but at the same time, it's just like I mean, as soon as like the funniest part of it, I mean, I was getting my ass kicked, but there was a part of it where like the inside of my mouth was like filled with blood. They busted my lip really bad, and one of them kicked me in the mouth. But yeah, my mouth was filled with blood, and they stood me up, like they had me held up like this, like 2 of them, like one on one side, one on the other, and then one of them grabbed me by the throat and like got right in my face, and I had that choking reflex, and I spit blood right in his face. So I was like, oops. And he right then and there, that's when basically Froggy came out with his pistol and like shot a few shots in the air, and those guys like fucked off. Basically, it's just a bunch of rednecks with liquid courage thinking that they're 10 feet tall and bulletproof. That is until an actual gun comes into play, and then they run like little bitches. But
I still don't understand the logic behind beating the crap out of you like that.
I assumed that it was because they were like the boyfriends of those girls or something. I don't know.
Either that or they had their eye on them and were hoping they were going to get to bang them at the party or something.
Yeah, and they decided to take me out, I guess. I don't know. Because,
like a display of violence on a dude that women are already interested in is definitely going to get the women interested in you instead.
Yeah, well, depends. Some women are into that, and some women are like abhorred by violence.
That's why I went to a party that I knew everyone that was a dude that was there, other than the chicks, like. And then I played keyboard, and then 2 of the chicks were just like, ooh, like. I actually remember them saying, like, it's like, isn't it so cool that he can play, like, something that's not a guitar like that? Because everybody plays guitar.
That's true. I will admit that. But that's the thing, is, like, I mean, I guess it's because I was playing, like, crowd pleasers. I was playing stuff that they knew, and, like, one of them asked me if I knew, one of them asked me, I think it was a Lana Del Rey song, I can't remember, but they were asking me that, and I was just like, maybe I do. I mean, can you sing it for me? And she's like, I can't do that. And she got really nervous and all that. I was like, no, it's all right. And then, how about this? And then I went into playing, I think it was, I got into playing Landslide, and like they knew that. And I was like, oh shit, okay. And then honestly, dude, it was just one of those things. And then
I didn't play any particular songs. I was just jamming on the keyboard. And
yeah,
the girls thought that was awesome.
Well, yeah, and in all honesty, that is cool. That's cool that you know how to play keyboard and everything. That you can basically just like play around and just have fun. Well,
but they were also alt girls too. So I mean, like,
yeah, fair enough.
Like your standard country chick or like pop. Like, you know, preppy chick probably wouldn't be all that impressed by what I was doing. They'd probably just be like, what the hell is that guy even playing?
These girls
never heard that song before.
These girls weren't alt girls, but they weren't like the full-on preppy chicks. They were like those, like art house girls. You know, the art house girls that are just a little artsy, but they're like a little artsy and a little country, I guess. But yeah, just that happening. I remembered I was sitting on the couch. I had like an ice pack on my head, and I had like a big old like gob of paper towels in my mouth, like stopping the bleeding in my mouth. And then Froggy like was sitting there with me, and then my girlfriend showed up, and she basically like, "Oh my God, what happened?" I was just like, and I was trying to talk like, Apparently those guys didn't like the fact that I was singing to those girls over there, and they didn't take very much kind to it, and they beat the shit out of me.
You say your girlfriend?
Yeah.
So you had a girlfriend, but you were serenading other women.
It wasn't my choice though, man. I mean, Froggy brought the guitar out to me and put me on the spot. And here's the thing, Shauna knew that
your girlfriend was pissed about that though.
Not really. Shauna knew that I was a musician. Here's the thing about it. Me and Shauna, like we were together and everything, and there was nothing that was gonna like tear us apart from her father, which he can go fuck himself. But we basically like, she understood that I was just like that. I like to perform. I was a crowd pleaser, and it wasn't like I was like kissing them or anything like that, or like, you know, having them like do anything like bad or anything. I was just playing. And then they just so happened to sing along. And then I remember, like, we went upstairs and I laid down on the bed and Shauna laid next to me. She was like, are you sure you're all right? I was like, I'm better now that you're here. Oh, God. And then basically I went to the urgent care the next day, and they told me that I cracked a rib, and basically it hurt to laugh for like a solid like few weeks. It was like I couldn't laugh without like my ribs on this side hurting really bad. But yeah, it was one of those things. And thankfully nothing too bad happened. Just got a little ass whooping. Ain't nothing ain't happened before. But anyway, that's enough about stories like that. Let's get into Mr. Ballin telling us a story. Here we go.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm going to share 2 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button leaves their phone out unattended, go ahead and pick it up and spam passwords over and over again until it locks them out of their phone for a week. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
My own
okay, let's get
phone,
into
wouldn't
today's
lock you out
stories.
for a week. It would reset the entire phone, the factory default, delete everything off of it.
Oh, that's even worse.
At around 8 p.m. on December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home, because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had a couple of drinks. You know, he didn't feel he had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, you know, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, you know, in the back back in Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years, and so he kind of had this fear of police already, and also Nestor was not born in America, and so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, you know, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console. And so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip. But then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink. And he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand. And instinctively, you know, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor amazingly was composed enough to not swerve wildly post impact, because he knew if he did that he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car.
I've had a similar situation where I spilled a fucking drink in my passenger side floorboard. My sister had given me a old styrofoam cup, like that she had washed out and stuff with a lid.
Yeah.
To take some tea with me to work at the mall.
Oh no.
And when I was coming through the stop sign into the mall parking lot, like, I tried to set it back down and the lid came off and it all spilled in my passenger side floorboard, and it distracted me as I came through that stop sign, and I didn't see the person speeding up into the entrance, and I like went over into the side of their car and dented in their back passenger, or the back driver's side door.
Ooh. Yeah.
I was like, fuck. Luckily, it didn't really hurt my car, and it was just a big dent in their back driver's side door, you know, and everybody was fine. I was just like, where the fuck did they even come from? But
that's a good question.
Spilling a drink apparently can distract you more than you think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's why, like, I try not to, like, get too distracted whenever I'm driving, because I take a drink with me, but it's usually like a bottle of water or something like that, or a bottle of something to drink. And yeah, I'm usually really good at, like, one hand on the wheel, unscrew the cap, set it down, take a drink, set it back down, screw the cap back on. I'm usually really good about that. I've actually gotten pretty adept at it, but yeah.
You've been better lately, but you used to be bad about texting while you drive and nearly swerving off the road and shit.
Well, yeah, and
it took me riding with you being like, dude, you're fucking swerving, and I'm just eventually was just like, if you need to send a text, just hand the phone to me and tell me what to type.
Fair enough.
Car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point, I mean, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. You know, no cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. You know, physically he was okay. You know, it seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. I mean, the deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, you know, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? Like, he can't really do anything. It's nighttime. No. And so he made the decision that, you know, nobody saw this, and it seems like everything's okay, so I'm just going to drive home, and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car.
Not good, man.
And so Nestor knew, you know, this is so conspicuous. He's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, you know, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start.
It probably busted his radiator, because that's usually the number one thing that happens, is like you slam into it and it busts the radiator and your car is now overheating.
Mm-hmm.
That happened to my cousin Josh in his Jeep. He smacked into one and he basically, I remember my dad said, "Nate, come on here," and he handed me a jug of he handed me a 1 gallon jug of water. I was like, "What's this about?" He's just like, "Cousin Josh hit a deer. We gotta go take this to him. His radiator's busted." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So we drive up the road a little bit, and there's my cousin Josh, just like the bottom of his car is just like pissing from all the from the water that's coming out of the radiator. So we basically just had to keep following him, and whenever his car would heat up too much, we get out, open it back up, pour enough water in for the radiator, then keep going.
Yeah.
And basically that's what we did. We did that until he got home, which thankfully he wasn't too far from home. It was about 4 or 5 miles, and I think we only had to stop once or twice. So basically, yeah, a busted radiator is typically what the problem is, and I'm not sure if that's the case here, but yeah, that sucks.
And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead. And he didn't have a phone charger in his car. And so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. And so Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. The whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around, and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. And so Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down, and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, "Get out of the car." So Nestor, he gets out of the car, and he's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? What have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, "What happened tonight? What's going on here?" And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot. And so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it. And as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, is there a law? If you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police. But the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? This whole night has been such a disaster. What did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he'd only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood.
Yeah.
Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police, but, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated. Earlier this year, we announced our very first Mr. Ballin book, a graphic novel. And the release date is fast approaching. It's coming out.
Drunk like that is a piece of shit.
I agree. I agree entirely. It's not cool, man. Not freaking cool.
On October 1st, which also happens to be my birthday. Now, this graphic novel was truly a labor of love. It took us well over a year to put this thing together, and I'm telling you, it's fantastic. There are 4 brand new feature-length stories that I have never told on any of our platforms, so 4 new, and then 5 OG, classic Mr. Ballin stories that have been re-edited and reformatted to fit the graphic novel. So, if you haven't done this already, go to book.ballinstudios.com to pre-order a copy of this amazing graphic novel so you can get it the moment it comes out, which again is in just a few weeks on October 1st. And if you're a fan of hearing my voice tell you stories, you're in luck, because I just finished recording the audiobook.
It's on Amazon. Oh, hardcover's $22.49. That's actually not bad. I'll have to look at getting that.
Version of the graphic novel, and I promise you it is not just me, reading the book on tape. It's not that. I actually went wildly off script for every story, spicing them up a bit, to the point where the director was a little bit concerned that I had gone so rogue during this audiobook. But I'm telling you, it wound up making the audiobook really unique. It's basically like its own thing now, and it's a great companion to the graphic novel because it's not just the words. It's like an expansion of what you're seeing on the page. So the audiobook, it's pretty good. So again,
Steven! Wow, dude! Steven just sent $70 to our Venmo.
Wow.
He wanted us to watch a video, me and JT, on Friday. Oh boy.
if you want a copy of the novel or the audiobook or both, just go to book.ballinstudios.com. Okay, back to the stories. On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl, who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs downstairs and put her to bed. And so Luce brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luce got up and she began making her way towards the door, and right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luce's family didn't stick around much longer after Luce came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luce realized she was totally exhausted and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luce decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor, and it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground, and she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luce jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luce charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there, and so without any hesitation, Luce charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter. And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luce is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luce out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside, and just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luce, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luce's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family.
Started the fire.
It seems that's the case, man. Damn.
She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luce also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so, of course, Luce is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because, again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luce began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luce became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luce was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and, Luce basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luce has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. Yeah. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luce walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. And so he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luce dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luce and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luce had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room.
What the
Instead, police believe after Luce came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose. but not before abducting the baby. And that person was one of Luz's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Delamar Vera. It was Luz's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luz was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luz knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out, like, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter.
Wow,
she did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luz had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing. Because when Luz went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter, but investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luz was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar. Okay, so if you're not listening to our show called Run Fool, then you are really missing out on a truly special and unique podcast. Now, it's technically a horror podcast, but honestly, it's so much more. Every episode is a fresh take on terrifying lore, like a modern ghost story wrapped up in a tightly spun narrative. Also, remember, Run Fool is a Ballin Studios podcast, which means there's always going to be a big plot twist or reveal at the end. Rodney Barnes is the iconic host of Run Fool, and every story he tells on there, it feels like this fully immersive horror movie. Also, the sound design on this show is like expert level. Barnes really knows what he's doing. Even if you never watch the show, you should tune in just for a second, at least once, just to hear Barnes's radio voice. It is like the best, most soothing voice I think I've ever heard. So if Run Fool feels like a show you might like, go run and follow the show and start listening.
Fool, what are you doing?
So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember, we have a whole slew of podcasts under the Ballin Studios umbrella. They are the Mr. Ballin podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Run Fool, Bedtime Stories, and Wartime Stories. All of them are free. There are loads of episodes, and they are all of the strange, dark, and mysterious variety. All you have to do is go to any podcast platform, look up Ballin Studios, and boom, there are all of our podcasts for you to go binge. Thank you very much. Until next time, see ya.
Phew. I say, dude, both those stories were pretty crazy.
At least the second one kind of had a happy ending.
Yes. Oh my gosh, dude. I'm just shocked at how that woman could do that. How could she do that? I get that there's people out there who are unable to conceive, but there's always adoption, dude. There's always adoption.
There's just people who are just, got something wrong with them in a really weird way, too.
Yeah. I don't know, man. But, yeah, these were good. These are some good stories. And, honestly, I'm glad we're back to watching Mr. Ballin. I missed reacting to Mr. Ballin to a fair amount, but anyway, hopefully y'all enjoyed this, and I guess until next time, everyone, signing off, I am Nate.
I am Nick.
Be good people. Take care. Peace.